adults as well. Um, and in the 94 video, I shared with you that we were food, that they were consuming humanity, and that they preferred children because they weren't spoiled or they weren't poisoned, and their their bodies were very vibrant because they were young. They would take these kids underground and they would torture them. They would absolutely freak them out, scare them to death, and they would scare them over long periods of time to the point where they would not allow them to sleep. And if they had passed out, they would wake them up and they would continue to torture. They would bring them literally to moments of death where their hearts were just going to explode and stop. And it would be at that particular point that they would consume them. And they would start with their liver and their organs, uh, from here down. That's where they would start. And it would be like a feeding frenzy. You could see them. It's they would change their disposition and their composure. The reptilians now would change while they were consuming the kids, their organs. Now the children were alive as they were being consumed, and at some point they stopped. But they would consume this part of the body to the waist. Um, and then the bodies would be dragged off to someplace else. Now, when we go to Dulce, and I'm going to bring Dulce into this, there were vats, big vats of what looked like blood that had body parts in it. And what the Tao, which we call the Greys, which Elena's people referred to as the Nabu, they would put their hand in these bats and they would take the fluid and they would put it on their arms and their bodies, and then their bodies would absorb the the fluid. And this is blood. This was human blood of people who had been tortured and chopped up, etc. And from what I understand from talking about people who had scientists who were actually pulled out of there, and from military people that survived, the Gray's disposition would change as well. In other words, our fear, the fear that humans were put through, is actually a narcotic, a drug for these extraterrestrials. Now, there have been several video movies, V being one of them, where they talk about consuming humans. But in that particular series, they would like it would almost be like we're a roast, and they would roast us and then put us on a table and do that. And then you also have what is it, spirit something that
Cooking.
Hollywood people do. What's it?
Spirit cooking.
Spirit cooking, right. um and they would take this syrup and or whatever it is on these bodies, um, and they would have these lavish parties. Again, doing this consumption of humanity has gone back thousands of years, but it was never done in front of humanity. It was always done in secret because we had to be unsuspecting in order for them to farm us. And that's basically what they were doing. Many of the reptilian races, especially those underground, were farming us. Now, the torture of young people and children, the way that it was done is if they had siblings, they would torture one and bring them to the point of death and then stop the torture. And then they would work on this other sibling and they would torture them to the point of near death, arousing the first victim. So they would go back and forth, and they would do this with, especially with siblings, because they knew there was an emotional connection. They knew there was a spiritual connection between the two siblings. And they would do this back and forth to get the children to a very specific point. And then they would consume both of them at the same time. And again, they would work on the organs from here down, okay, to the waist, to the reproductive organs. That's what they would do. And they would consume those while the children were still alive, after getting them back and forth to this point. Some of these torture sessions would last hours. Some were very, very short. I don't know how the reptilians knew how far they could push some of these kids, but somehow they knew. Obviously, they're very, very experienced with this, and this is not something that was new to Earth. This is something that the reptilian nations or civilizations, not all of them, but the ones that were here, that were particular to the Orion system, they had a long history of knowing how to do this. And this was brought to Earth. These techniques were brought to Earth. And how I think the elite of this world, this was shared with them by the extraterrestrials, because it was a way to know how to control the elite, how to addict them to this process, and to give them longer lifespans, and to make sure that they would comply with whatever the rules and regs were going to be, whatever it was that they were going to do with humanity, whatever processes they wanted to use us for. That was something that this was a way to bring in control. And at the same time, humanity because of the nature of our bloodlines and the fact that we have this compendium of all these different bloodlines, when they started exporting human trafficking us off world, they knew specifically